Okay, so we've talked about the meaning of Shema Yisrael. We've talked about the meaning of Hashem Elokeinu. And yesterday we talked about Hashem Echad, that God is one. So we've touched on the meaning of the word Echad, one. And I said yesterday that today we're going to talk about why we say that God is one, as opposed to God being the only. So here's the thing about saying Shema, about this passage. We've talked about the fact that this is a seminal prayer. This is the prayer that people say. It's been on countless martyrs' lips as they were dying because they were Jewish, dying, remaining faithful to God. They die proclaiming this phrase, this verse, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So what is so profound about this verse? When we say Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, that God is one, what do we mean when we say God is one? So the first thing you would think, God is one, meaning we know Abraham, the first Jew, brought monotheism to the world. God is the only God. But really, when we say this statement that God is one, we're not saying that God is we're also saying God is the only God, but that's not the only thing we're saying. If we were saying that God is the only God, we could have said Hashem Yachid, the only God. But when you say one always implies that there's two. So what does it mean that we say God is one? If we're trying to say that he's the only one, exclusive, so why do we say he's one? So here there's a certain depth that we get that's captured in the word Echad. And that is that what we're saying is not just that God is the only God. That Judaism gave to the world truthfully a long time ago. Abraham introduces that to the world, and that's been a foundation of Judaism. But really, Abraham's teaching goes beyond just that there's only one God as opposed to many gods. What Abraham brings to the world, what Judaism teaches, is that God is not only one, but that all of reality is not a challenge or a contradiction to God's oneness. So it's not just that God's the only God, but God is the only existence. And that's what we're saying when we say the Shema. And that would explain why so many people died with the words of the Shema on their lips, to say that God is the only true reality. God is the only reality. So how does this work? What does it mean when we say that God is the only reality, or that the world doesn't contradict God's oneness? So when we say one, as I said, one implies that there's two. And yet we're saying, even though it seems that there are two, I'm living in a world, I exist, I'm saying, I'm the one saying the Shema, which means that there's me. It's not just God, one God, there's me as well, plus the world around me. And yet we're saying, so even though that there's an implication that there's two, but still God is one. There's only his oneness. How does that work? So just a brief meditation on this, that sort of a logical progression of this idea. You start with a first cause, right? That's what we mean when we say, they're okay, let's not get sidetracked. But the idea of God is a first cause. We call him God, but call him whatever you want. Most of humanity believes in a first cause of some kind, right? Science is really all built on teleology, which is the idea of a first cause, and the idea that there's a beginning to everything. So what happens when you arrive at the beginning? What happens when you get to the beginning? The first existence. Well, if it's a first existence, it means that it couldn't have come into existence from anything else, right? And so that's what we mean by, that's the meaning of first cause, which means that a first cause is not going to look, it doesn't share any characteristics with anything that comes after it. The thing that brings everything else into existence exists essentially differently than everything else that exists, because everything else that exists conditionally, exists dependent on that first thing. Whereas the first cause exists independent of anything else. So its whole existence is completely different than anything else. So that's what we mean, that God is a first cause. God always does. My son asked me last night, my first grader, what was the beginning? What came before God? Who created God? If he was created, then he's not God. So God has to exist. So in other words, God exists essentially. And so God's existence is essential. Everything else that comes from God, this big bad world, this big, large, vast universe, this amazing, miraculous universe, its existence is all conditional, because there was a time that it wasn't. So its existence is conditional, it's not essential. In fact, as we say in davening as well, that God is constantly recreating the world, because the world has to constantly be brought into existence from non-existence, because everything likes to revert back to its original state, and the world's original state is non-existence. So its existence is a conditional one, and one that has to constantly be sustained by God. Okay? So when we say that God is one, what we're saying is also that God is the only true existence. In other words, since everything else exists conditionally and everything else therefore has to be brought into existence at all times, so everything's real nature is non-existence. So what's the only thing that really exists? Just God. So that's part of it. I mean, this is a longer conversation. I just wanted to share one idea of this concept of God as one. Is this part of it? And this is a very logical progression that you get to if you follow a first cause and understand the nature of the first cause. Then it has to exist independently of anything else, not be dependent on anything else, not be conditional, and therefore it exists different than everything else. And so that's what we mean when we say God is one. That God is the only one true existence. That no other existence exists like God, right? So this opens up. There's more to this idea of God's oneness, but that's enough for today. But this opens up obviously the question: if God's the only true existence, then if we don't really exist, or if the world doesn't really exist, then what's the point of everything we do? So that's a question that we have to deal with. But it's already a good question to ask. Think about that journey that a person could take from thinking they're the only real existence in the center of the universe to contemplating, well, if I don't really exist, then why do I matter at all? So that's a different question that we can address another time. That's not related specifically to the Shema, at least to this first verse. But that's the idea of Hashem Echad, that God is one. And this idea that God is one, that He's the only true existence, if we can really truly internalize that, then our whole lives are going to be different. Then we'll live our lives in a different way. We will live differently. This is one of the reasons it says that Moses established that the Jews should read the Shema every day, twice a day, when they enter the land of Israel. Right? It was something in the desert they didn't have to. In the desert they lived in this spiritual cocoon. They saw God. They saw these miracles. They had no. They're basically in quarantine. They had no jobs, no careers. They didn't have to make a living. Everything was taken care of. The government was paying their salaries. It was a machaya. Suddenly they go to the land of Israel and they get thrown into this mundane life. So Moses tells them, listen, you want to survive it. You want to keep your head about you. You want to not get sucked in and dragged down into the mire of everyday life and all those pressures. Say the Shema. Contemplate, reflect on this idea of God's oneness. And when we reflect on that, that already changes our whole perspective of everything and allows us to see things clearly and hopefully lessen our anxieties in the process. Okay, so that's a little bit about the Shema. We'll conclude